The purpose of the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force is to preserve the material and cultural heritage of the United States Air Force and its predecessor organizations. Having said that, we have more than 300 aerospace vehicles and so on, things related to those, on display for the public to see, and many thousands of other artifacts that are in field museums and on loan to other museums around the country and around the world. Here at the main campus of the museum system for the Air Force, there are about 17 acres of exhibits for visitors to see. There's something for everybody here. We're here in the Presidential Gallery at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, and this is where we keep all of the so-called Air Force One and related airplanes that the Air Force has used to carry presidents and other VIPs and dignitaries. The plane behind us right now is the only VC-54C ever built. It was built for President Roosevelt beginning in 1944, and he only used it once in 1945 to go to the Yalta Conference. It wasn't called Air Force One at the time because at that time the Air Force hadn't been created yet. But this was the first purpose-built airplane used to transport a President of the United States. What's unique and special about this airplane is that it's the only C-54C ever built. Probably the outstanding feature of this airplane is the elevator in the aft fuselage. This was used to get President Roosevelt in and out of the airplane. This had to be built because it was very difficult for him to get, in and out of vehicles like this without a wheelchair lift. He used this aircraft exactly once to go to the Yalta Conference in 1945. He passed away shortly after that, and so the airplane remained in service for about 27 months after Roosevelt's death. But it was unfortunate that he was only able to use it once because it was built to carry the President around. The plane does have a unique name. It's called the Sacred Cow. That name was never official, but the reason it's called the Sacred Cow is because ground personnel regarded the airplane as a restricted area. It was a special airplane. You couldn't go near it. You couldn't get at it. It needed special treatment. And so they started talking about it as the Sacred Cow. You can't go near it. You can't touch it. Well, the name stuck. And despite the White House's efforts to squelch that name, it became popular with the press, and the airplane's been known as the Sacred Cow ever since. There is another interesting aspect to this airplane. Not only was this President Roosevelt's airplane, but as it became Truman's airplane, this airplane became the birthplace of the United States Air Force. In 1947, the National Security Act of 1947 established what was then called the National Defense Establishment, later known as the Department of Defense. Within that, the Department of the Air Force was created. That created the United States Air Force as a separate service. We have on display here at the museum the pen that President Truman used to sign the National Security Act of 1947. So, from small things, great consequences. The Department of Defense and the Air Force, as we know them today, came from that signing, and this pen is a small prosaic object that connects us with that day and that act, and gives us a sort of touchstone to say, he held this pen, he signed the act, the Air Force was created, and we can look at this as an icon of that moment. We're at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force's Air Power Gallery at the tail end of the World War II story. The first thing we're going to look at is Mark III atomic weapon, more widely known as a Fat Man atomic bomb. The reason this is significant is because it is a sign or a signal of the beginning of the atomic age, the end of World War II, and it's a marker of the supremacy of American military and scientific and industrial power at mid-century and the end of World War II. The reason it's called Fat Man is obvious. It's a big round bomb. Its shape is mainly because of its method. It's round because it's a so-called implosion weapon. There's a sphere of explosives that compress a smaller sphere of fissile material to create a chain reaction that releases tremendous energy, resulting in an atomic explosion. The weapon that we have on display is real. It is a Mark III atomic weapon. It has been restored to look like the Fat Man bomb that was dropped on August the 9th, 1945. This was one of many Mark IIIs that were manufactured after the war and up until about 1949. They were withdrawn from service in 1950. This was an iteration of that first design used during the war, and of course nuclear weapons design progressed very quickly after the war, and so this was obsolete within only a couple of years after it was designed and built. Thereafter the shape just was stored. It was displayed for the first time in a museum in 1965, and we restored it in 2005 so that it looked like the Fat Man that was used at the end of World War II. The lettering on the front is a curiosity. We think it stands for Joint Army-Navy Combined Foul-Up. These guys that put these things together were young men doing a tough job, and a lot of times you'll see nose art with words and pictures and so on that are kind of non-standard, and I guess you could say this is one of them. And of course the other little stencil, FM, inside the little bomb shape is obviously Fat Man. So the stuff above it is about Army-Navy cooperation to get a tough job done and done well. Now we're in the Research and Development Gallery at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, where we keep all the airplanes that we have that were used to test new ideas, to further develop old ideas, and to bring new technology and new capability to the Air Force. Today we're going to focus on the North American XB-70A Valkyrie. This airplane is one of the first ones people ask for in the museum. They show up and they say, "Where is the Valkyrie?" And it's called Valkyrie because there was a Name the XB-70 contest with 20,000 entries. And if you look up what a Valkyrie is, it fits high speed, high altitude perfectly well. I think the reason this one gets so much interest is because it is one of the most exotic airplanes ever built. It is sleek, it is large, it just says speed and power, and that's what people want to see in an exotic airplane. This airplane was developed in the mid to late 1950s. It was supposed to be the ultimate high-speed, high-altitude nuclear bomber. This was a Cold War effort. It was specifically intended to deliver nuclear weapons to the Soviet Union. The only thing that could stop this bomber, that it was thought, is improved high-speed interceptors and better surface-to-air missiles. Both of those things came about. With a combination of other factors, it meant that the XB-70 program was steadily defunded to the point where only 2 experimental models were built. There were other things happening. The advent of intercontinental ballistic missiles made long-range, high-altitude bombers seem obsolete at the time. That's part of the reason, along with other factors, of why that program was defunded, and we only got 2 XB-70s. The other one, unfortunately, crashed in 1966 as the result of a mid-air collision during testing. The last thing we're going to look at is one of the most recently declassified reconnaissance satellites that served the Air Force up into the middle 1980s. This is a so-called KH-9 hexagon reconnaissance satellite. There were 19 successful KH-9 launches between 1971 and 1986. Satellites, especially reconnaissance satellites, are all about knowledge. This one in particular is about visual information. This was one of the last so-called wet film satellites used. In fact, it was the last satellite that processed actual strips of film and sent them back to Earth for intelligence analysis. What this satellite would do was circle the Earth in a polar orbit and image the Earth's surface with some very powerful cameras, and then it would collect its film and send the film back down to Earth in these little buckets with parachutes on them, and those buckets would be snatched out of the sky by Air Force aircraft, and the film rushed to laboratories to be processed and analyzed and interpreted. This particular satellite was a so-called large area satellite. Its job was to scan places like the Soviet Union and China and other places, looking for changes in the landscape that would give us clues about weapons development and even things like agricultural projects and geophysical projects, anything that would give us current, up-to-date, detailed visual information about our adversaries' capabilities and intentions. Most of this information had to come from orbital photography. It was not safe after 1960 to fly airplanes over those denied territories because they would get shot down. But it's very hard to shoot down a satellite, and so the idea was put the cameras in space, make them much more powerful, and then get the information back from the satellites. This system, the KH-9 and others like it, its predecessors, were classified for a long, long time. The Hexagon satellite was declassified in 2011, and we got ours on loan from the National Reconnaissance Office in early 2012 to display here. And we had a big event, and a lot of people that worked on the system and with the system, a lot of the Air Force people that supported it with telemetry and tracking and range safety and recovery aircraft and film interpretation and film transportation, all that stuff. These people came together at this event to see something that they thought would never be seen by the public, and they could talk about things that for many years they were not allowed to talk about at all. This object is in the museum because it's a critical component of not only the Cold War story, but the Air Force and the Cold War story. The Air Force had an awful lot to do, as you know, with retrieving the film, providing ground support, range safety, launches, et cetera, et cetera. So the Air Force played a critical role in this information gathering technology. And the Air Force has always been a highly technologically savvy service. Technology is our strong suit. We have also always been about the high ground. The high ground is where you go to know what your adversary's intentions and capabilities are. Satellite reconnaissance is the highest of the high ground, and that's why this is here, to show us the pinnacle of wet film satellite technology and the Air Force involvement in it in the Cold War.